Well, I don't have to do much to set the world on fire. I think the residence halls are pretty hot as it is right now. Um, maybe the air conditioning will come on soon if we pray hard enough for it. But I have the distinct honor and privilege tonight to introduce Professor Brian Brayman of the Perspectives Program in the Philosophy Department. He came to BC as a doctoral student in 1989 and is now an adjunct associate professor. He has been a student favorite at BC for a long time. Professor Brayman's commitment is evident not only through his dedication to the Philosophy Department and the Perspectives Program, but also through a deep belief in the need to positively enhance student life on campus. He is famous for inviting students into his home and preparing meals for them with his wife, Peggy, who's a real tour de force in his life. Not surprisingly, in April of 2005, Dr. Brian Brayman was presented with the Mary Kay Waldron Award, BC's only student-nominated and student-selected award. The event honors an outstanding full-time faculty member or administrator who has demonstrated a continuing commitment to the values and ideals of Boston College and who has worked to enhance student life. Students and colleagues alike note the passion and enthusiasm that Professor Brayman brings to the classroom and the love of learning he inspires in his students. Besides his excellence in the classroom, his students and colleagues have praised him for his availability and sincere interest to help his students on a daily basis, usually by haunting the rat of all dining halls. His good fashion sense also doesn't go unnoticed. Also in the rat of all dining. As Professor Brayman says of himself, it is a sign of his taking what he does seriously. So, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Brian Brayman.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Mary Ann's for closing early tonight, so it gives you all something to do. My seniors told me I had to come up with new jokes, so we're trying out some stuff. Anyway, I want to thank everyone at the Church of the 21st Century and Rick Rossi, and of course Dano for that lovely introduction to give me an opportunity to do the I don't know if it's an honor to do the last one or but I am privileged and fortunate to be able to stand up here and hopefully share some thoughts with you. I think you advertised the title of this is The Life of the Mind, or The Intellectual Life as Friendship with God. This is a topic that has been near and dear to my heart for a number of years, given my work at BC, and just given the intellectual formation I've had in philosophy and in theology, and reading some significant people in my life like Bernard Lonergan, the Jesuit philosopher and theologian. In fact, there's a center dedicated to his thought here. And one of the things, that particularly teaching in Perspectives 1, one of the things that has become abundantly clear to me over these last many years in teaching Perspectives 1 is that the relationship between faith and reason is foundational in anything that we do in our lives. And it's not something that one should think about severing or splitting apart, because they both have a tremendous role to play in terms of helping us understand who we are and what our life ought to be. Now, I had about a 40-page paper I was going to read tonight, but I thought in the interest of time, and you'll all be a lot older by the time I finish, I've just got some notes. What I want to do is I want to tell you an intellectual story. And I want to tell you an intellectual story as a way in which to contextualize how to think about your life as men and women of the 21st century. If you're familiar with Gauguin's masterpiece work down at the MFA, where did we come from, what are we, and where are we going? You've had an opportunity to see that. It's basically Gauguin's question about human history. Where's it going? Where did it come from? What's it about? Tonight's presentation is along those same lines. I want to think about telling us a story about where we came from, where we might be going, and ultimately, who are we? Now, for a number of you who have already taken me in Perspectives 1, or if you've had Perspectives, or even, I suspect, Philosophy of the Person, you know that the story that I tell begins with the Greeks. And it begins with Plato and Aristotle primarily. And it begins with the way in which they think about what does it mean to know? What does it mean to think? What does it mean to be human? Later on with Augustine and Aquinas, we have the same questions being asked, and it gets fleshed out a little more fully. So for these four thinkers that we affectionately call the pre-moderns, basically, the eros of the mind that they tell us about is this set of questions that come out of the deepest longing in our hearts for things that are noble, for things that are beautiful, for things that are significant. And for these thinkers, then, this kind of dynamic desire is what moves us forward. It what helps us make sense in our life. It gives us an orientation. Now, the story takes a dramatic turn, however, when we get to the rise of the modern project. Beginning with Machiavelli and then Hobbes, we know all the usual suspects. One of the people I'd like to just focus on briefly is John Locke. Because John Locke was foundational not only in the history of philosophy, but for all you poli-sci majors, you already know this, and anyone else, Locke was absolutely instrumental in the intellectual shaping of this republic. Now, one of the things that Locke ends up doing, he ends up talking about the human person as this kind of punctual self. This is a person who's not tied to anything greater than his or her own desires. So what's most important is what satisfies a particular pleasure, particular material desire. And so for Locke, there's no kind of transcendence that calls you outside of yourself. It calls you in such a way as to help you maybe become more than what you are. What you are is this kind of person who's motivated by his or her desires and not tied to anything else other than those desires. Now, coupled with our friend Johnny Locke from the block, my stage manager, can you hear me over yonder? Yes, okay. And over here? Thank you. All right. All right, so coupled with John Locke, though, is René Descartes. And again, those of you who struggled through the meditations of the Discourse on Method, one of the things we discover about Descartes is that indeed he also ends up kind of collapsing his own intellectual orientation in upon himself. So what Descartes gives us and what Locke gives us is a certain sovereignty of the self. That is, I am the person who basically knows what's best. I am the person who determines what's best, and there's really kind of no other conversations to be had about that. Now, in some ways I'm kind of caricaturizing this, but it still is a way in which this kind of self-sovereignty becomes the dominant mode of the way in which we want to think about our lives. And also what happens in this kind of collapse upon the self, that our intellect is merely a tool to help us figure out how to get what it is that we need. This also reduces our religious orientations in such a way that they become merely a private desire. That our own personal religious orientations or aspirations end up being such things, and I've had many a heated conversation with my students about this. Following your bliss, I'm spiritual but not religious. We know all the terms. And I mean, I understand partly what's going on with that. But I think the dark side of that is what happens is that when we isolate ourselves in the context of thinking about ourselves as men and women who hunger for something greater than ourselves, and particularly if it's a religious desire, if this somehow is not placed in the conversation of a community that actually can call you on the carpet about the things that you believe, then it ends up just kind of reinforcing this atomism, this religious kind of self-centeredness. And for individuals who find themselves completely kind of committed to the one-dimensional notion of I'm a spiritual person, etc., to suggest that maybe one ought to think about having this kind of conversation in a larger communal setting becomes problematic. Why? Because of this whole turn to the sovereignty of the self. That I know what's best and no one else really can tell me otherwise. So to think about a kind of conversation, whether intellectual or religious, that is communal, is really antithetical to this self-sovereignty. Anyone from Missouri? Okay. So, that's all right. One is enough. Oh, thank you. All right. So, it used to be on the license plate that the motto of the state was the Show Me State. Now, it's an interesting tagline because what it reinforces is something that de Tocqueville said about Americans when he came here in the 19th century and he ended up writing his masterpiece, Democracy in America. He said Americans are Cartesians. Now, I don't know about you, but I used to be in a bowling league, and the people that I bowled with didn't read a lot of Descartes. So what was he getting at? So what was he getting at when he said that Americans are Cartesians? Basically what he was getting at was that we live by the principle that I know best. And if I don't know best, then you need to prove it to me. I'm not buying it unless you prove it to me. So again, it kind of reinforces this certain sense of isolated self, that there's nothing really higher that could call me to raise questions about my positions. So the overarching effects of this kind of sovereignty, particularly in what I want to talk about tonight, is that it makes the life of the mind, with the intellectual life, tone deaf to any religious concerns. This afternoon, Father James Woods, you may or may not be familiar with him, but he's dean, and the school's named after him. It's the College of Advancing Studies. And they had a party for him today because he's retiring after, forever. 45 years. But he's a great man. And one of the things that was significant for Father Woods was to ensure that men and women who couldn't afford the kind of tuition pop that maybe most mainline schools that we're familiar with in this area demand, to give people an affordable and quality education to be able to raise themselves up. And what was behind this vision? What was behind this vision was not only a quality education, but it was also a quality call to a religious kind of orientation. Doesn't mean that the students have this, but the way Father Woods thought about this. One of the speakers that they had at his presentation was a man named Clayton Christensen, who's at Harvard Business School. And they read his resume, and honest to God, I think the only thing he never won was the Nobel Prize for something. Clearly an accomplished man. And what was interesting was he talked about the role of religion in education, and that the role of religion in democracy, for democracy to work, is paramount. But if we are this kind of cultural aggregate of individuals who are collapsed upon ourselves, it makes a conversation along these lines very difficult. All right. So that's the end of the first part of the story. The second part is going to do with friendship. You've all, I would suspect 99.9% of you, have worked your way through Aristotle. And you have the book bronzed and on your desk, and every night you pray to Aristotle for wisdom. One of the One of the significant chapters, obviously, is his chapter on friendship. And we know how rich it is. But someone else who also wrote on friendship, who was just as rich, was Cicero. And Cicero argues in his De Amicitia that life is only worth living if it rests upon or in mutual friends. So the worth of our life and the living of that life is only valuable if it's in the context of friendships. Friendships constitute or help constitute who we are and what we should be. To understand myself, I need friends. When you find yourselves married or with partners, one of the things you will discover is they will always keep you honest. You will always know who you are. And that's important in a friendship. So friendship is rooted in the position that we are what Charles Taylor, who was here in the fall, famous contemporary philosopher, we're dialogical beings. That means we're men and women meant for conversation. We're meant to be in communion and conversation with others. And it's only in this conversation with others that we can discover how we ought to live or how the good life actually looks through the eyes of someone else. Friendship, from Cicero's point of view, is an exercise where one is willing to place his or her life in the needs and hands of another person. And that takes a tremendous amount of courage to allow yourself to be placed in the hands and needs of another person. So clearly this is something that has to be rooted in trust. It has to be rooted in honesty. It has to be rooted in a willingness to give of yourself, to move beyond the kind of atomistic story that we tend to subscribe to more often than not. Friendships are the training schools for virtue. True friends are those friends that will help you become a virtuous man or woman, a person who will be called out of him or herself for something greater. I need some water. All right. So how does all this fit into the final kind of point of this story? Culturally, we inherited a certain kind of sensibility that talks about how we are sovereign unto ourselves. And there are certain problems that come with that. Out of that then comes perhaps an inability or perhaps a naivete that somehow I don't need to be in conversations with others about the highest things in life. Friendship, thinking about it as Cicero and Aristotle, friendships are those things that work against the kind of sovereignty of the self. The willingness to give of yourself to someone that you call your friend, to spend time, to listen to what that person has to say about who you are and what you are as a human being. I do half times. And one of the things we talk about when I talk about friendship is that friends are important, if nothing else, because they keep you from embarrassing yourself. So if you can remember the Seinfeld episode where Elaine thought she could dance, if they were really friends, they would have said, Elaine, you don't want to be doing that, all right, because you suck. All right. So friendship then is the way in which I want to kind of proceed to the final part of this overall story. And that is to think about the intellectual life as friendship with God. Now, what do I mean by the intellectual life? I mean, there's a couple of ways that you can actually think about this. One is, right now in your own life as students, studying. Committing yourself to what it is that you're doing intellectually. Look, I know, and I know all too well, those moments when you've gone to class and you ask yourself, I'd rather have a hot poker stuck in my eye than sit here and listen to this. I did a degree in theology in Rome before my PhD in philosophy. And I remember, okay, this is probably I shouldn't something for public consumption, but nonetheless. So I had this Christology course, right, which is the theological exploration of the person of Christ. And the Jesuit who taught it, his name was Jean Galot. And at that time, this was in the early 80s, Jean Galot was the world's foremost authority in Christology. So I go into the first day of class, and it's an enormous lecture hall. It's even bigger than Devlin, right? But it's not cantilevered. It's just these banks and banks of tables that seem to go forever. He walks in, goes right to the front of the aula, sits down, opens up his latest book on Christology, and starts reading to us. Now, I was somewhat older, and I thought, I can read. So I don't need to sit here and have him read to me. But this stuff is important. So what did I do? I bought all his books. For the time that I was supposed to have been in class, this was tough duty, I admit it freely. I sat in front of the Pantheon, drinking coffee and reading Christology. And then I went in for the exam at the end, and I seemed not to suck too bad. But the point is that, look, I know we've all had these kinds of experiences of bad classroom teachers, whatever. What I'm trying to suggest is that if you take what I want to say seriously, no matter how bad it is, it's going to be an opportunity to discover something significant about your own mind, and what I would like to suggest eventually, to discover something about God. Even in economics, it's possible to discover something about God, or in large biology halls. So anyway, so one of the ways of thinking about the intellectual life is to think about what you're doing right here now. Studying. There's an old Latin phrase called age quod ages. Do what you're doing. And what are you called to do right now? You're called to be students. You're called to use your mind. You're called to be men and women who want to be intelligent. The other part of that, too, is that some of you will go on to graduate school. And so the intellectual life will look much different in terms of writing papers, doing research, preparing classes, thinking about new things to say to your students so they don't get brain concussions when they're falling asleep and their head hits the desk. So it's all ways in which we are trying to intellectually keep ourselves engaged. On a much broader scale, I want to suggest that the life of the mind is a commitment to be intelligent, a commitment to raise questions about your life, the world around you, and whether things can be better or not. Now, how does this fit in with friendship with God? I think it is absolutely significant to appreciate the radical shift that took place with God's self-revelation to the Jews. If you remember from Aristotle's book on friendship, he said you can't be friends with the gods. It's absolutely impossible, because there's a fundamental inequality that can never be bridged. But what God told the Jews, and what later God reveals in the person of Christ, is that I want to be your friend. I want to be in relationship to you. I want us to be in union with each other. So friendship with God is something that God really desires. And this is made possible through grace. Grace is the Trinity. It's self-communication to us, raising our minds up to share in God. Our friendship with God is made possible in this grace, and it's an interpersonal relationship between Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And the gift that is given to us in this friendship is infinite love. To have this experience of being loved by the triune God should be transformative. It should be a form of conversion where our whole life is reoriented around what is really best. what is really significant, what is really worthwhile. We should become the being in love. Our whole dynamic orientation. I gotta hope that's not a fire. So our whole dynamic orientation from this experience of being grasped by triune love, falling in love with God in that experience, is to open up our orientation to the infinite. One of the things that I didn't mention in the first part of our story that I think is helpful to bring back in here is that Max Weber, those of you who may be taking Perspectives 3, Horizon of the Social Sciences, struggling your way through the essay on vocation as science, or science as vocation. In that essay, Weber talks about the way in which the universe has become rationalized, mechanized, and disenchanted. What's been lost? Mystery, wonder, an opportunity to be awed by something significant. We've got sociobiology that tells us we're just the product of our evolutionary experiences, and this is all there is. So there's a whole narrative out there that reinforces the fact that the world in which we live is kind of sterile. It's empty. It doesn't really say anything significant to us other than a set of operations that need to be mastered. What I'd like to suggest is that to have this experience of falling in love and being grasped by the love of the Trinity is to all of a sudden open up your intellectual horizons to realize the wonder of the universe, to realize the wonder of another human being, to realize the beauty of the life that you've been given, of the beauty of the world that you have your life unfolding in. To have this kind of experience means then that we are called to really feel, as Augustine tells us, how we are the created participation in the uncreated light. What Augustine means by that is that our intellects is what makes us most like God. And it is in this dynamic orientation of our intellects that participate in the divine intellect. So this doesn't sound like it's too much pie in the sky. Think about experiences you've had with insights. Those experiences where you've caught on to something. There's been a flash of illumination. There's been, oh my God, this is what it means. Insights come as gifts. They are given to us. They are given to us by the dynamic operations that we set in motion and the willingness to participate in the infinite intelligence that is God. In other words, to have this experience of an insight is to know that our minds are given gifts. We can set the conditions, we can raise the questions, but again, your own experience of trying to get a hold of something, how long it has taken sometimes for you to figure out a problem, then all of a sudden, maybe a day or so later, it hits you. Right? You can't force it. You can't beg it. You can't buy it online. It's something that comes as a tremendous gift. And to think about that gift as it's rooted in our own intellectual participation as creatures into the infinite, uncreated intellect that is God. So insights then come as this participation. One of the things that Augustine says, and I think more and more, I think this is really, 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 really true. Augustine says you can't know anything until you really first love it. So that means this experience of friendship with God, falling in love with God, allowing your minds to unfold in the context of this love, opens up possibilities of understanding what it is that may not have been available to you before. Remember Pascal's famous saying, "The heart has reasons which reason doesn't know." What Pascal is arguing here is that the experience of being in love opens you up to understandings that other people don't experience. I've used this example ad nauseum, but it always seems to work. Just remember those happy days in high school or middle school when, I'm being facetious, you know that, right? When you would say to your friend, "I have no idea what she sees in him. I have no idea what he sees in her." Now, assuming it's a healthy relationship, one of the things that those kinds of phrases seem to suggest is that there's something going on between the two of them that is open to them because of being in love. That their understanding, that their knowing is somehow much richer because of this experience of being in love. So to share in the triune love, more importantly, it's to share in the way in which Christ has come to us, at least in the Catholic tradition, through the sacramental life. So to share in the love of Christ is basically to share in the knowledge of Christ and to be in union with Christ. And it's also the reversal. Christ shares in our knowledge. Christ shares with our struggles, with our emotions, with our insights. So it's not just a one-way sort of experience. Cicero said that friends are an amicus alter ipse, another self. And this is an analogy, and all analogies limp after a while. But in this kind of friendship, where we have been embraced by God's love, and more specifically, when we have been embraced by that love to the extent that our minds now are operating as they ought to, we're willing to ask the kinds of questions, we're willing to listen to the answers, we're willing to be humble before what it is we don't know, we then are in relationship with another self. Now again, it limps because Christ is both God and man, but the human part of who Jesus is resonates very deeply with our own experiences. So think about Luke's gospel. When Luke writes that Jesus grew in wisdom and maturity. So Christ's own experience of his humanity was growing in understanding. Understanding who he is, what his mission is, and a big part of that understanding came from his willingness to pray. His willingness to be present to the Father in prayer, to allow the Father to speak to him in the deepest recesses of his being. So the intellectual life then, and in this friendship with God, should encompass everything about who we are and what we're about. All our knowing, all our doing, all our teaching, researching, studying, whatever we're doing in the business world, whatever our occupation or activity is, ultimately is directed towards understanding in the long run who this God is that I claim to be in love with. And then the proximate end of this activity is trying to figure out the best way to come to understand how to bring about the good that God wants for us, for our community, and for the cosmos, and for the church. So, if we're dialogical beings, that means we're made for conversations. Then the most profound conversation in friendship we can have is in terms of this conversation with the Trinity, in love, about how or what it means to be truly human and how ought I to live my life. So true conversation then is going to be a conversation about what matters most. And it's going to be through our intellectual operations, our desire to know, that helps us come to understand what that might look like. It's the very eros of the mind that the Greeks talked about that now gets talked about in terms of, as Aquinas said, the fundamental desire to know that we all experience ultimately is the desire to know God. And to know God and God's totality, which means to know and be in love with the Trinity. So, we're dialogical beings. Friendship with God then should open our minds up to something that is, it should remind us of what a wonderful world we have. What a mystery it is. And by mystery, I don't mean it's, some sort of hocus pocus. It means that there is so much to understand that we can't seem to get a hold of it at this given point. I can remember reading when I taught Perspectives 4, when Newton came up with, his New World Order. And he talked about gravity as this force. And Christian Huygens, the guy who gave us centripetal force, basically was quoted to have said, "I hope it's not another one of those occult forces." And what he was getting at was, if it wasn't something you could look at, if it wasn't something you could see, then it was all this woodgy stuff. And that's not science. What I'd like to argue is that when we talk about mystery, we're talking about how there is so much to understand. And that it's a lifetime journey for all of us in trying to understand ourselves, the world around us, and even scientists are always trying to understand more and more and more about the world in which we live. So when I talk about the intellectual life and its relationship to the various things we're doing, I'm certainly not talking about things like Christian math or Christian biology. I wouldn't even know what that looked like. But what I'm talking about is the capacity to be moved by wonder. How many people still wondered when they saw the shuttle launched? Few. How many people tonight, we were walking over here, we looked up at the sky. It was just beautiful. It was just absolutely gorgeous. How many of you looked at the heavens and wonder about how magnificent this all is? And what does this all mean? So, what I'm suggesting is that the life of the mind is going to be open to a new appreciation of our world. And that not everything we do has to have pragmatic consequences. A number of years ago, I was listening to the NPR, and they had a woman on there who was a theoretical mathematician at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and she did multiple dimensional geometries. And I remember the interviewer saying, typical, and you just want to kind of reach to the radio and strangle them, "Well, what good is it?" I'm thinking, man, that's the wrong question. But she had a great response. She said, "I do it because it's beautiful. I do it because it's beautiful. There's something wondrous about this, even if it has no pragmatic applications." One of my students, who's a senior, I will embarrass him publicly, Joe Falkson. Joe is doing the honor sequence in philosophy through perspectives, and he's also a math major. I have never seen anyone's eyes twinkle more than when he's talking about mathematics. Because for Joe, it's not about what can I do with it, even though there are pragmatic applications, but because there's something profoundly wonderful and beautiful about this, in and of itself. So when we think about then the life of our mind and friendship with God, it should open us up again, to repeat myself, to a world that's rich and wondrous and beautiful and not subject to the kind of mechanization sometimes we like to reduce things to. So in our conversations we have with each other and with God, it's a conversation about, again, what is really the stake or the point of my life? there's a couple other things I was going to mention, but I'm just going to kind of throw something else in here. From one point of view, we have no idea where the universe is heading. Right? Philosophically, we can just kind of affirm the fact that the universe is evolutionary and dynamic, and it's on the move. But where it's going to go, what it's going to be, don't know. But from the point of view of faith, we know that the universe is moving towards being what it is that God has always wanted it to be when creation first began. But it's governed by schedules of probability. That is to say, it's not certain. And if we think about our lives as a story, and it is a story, and we are part of a much larger drama that began when we first left the swamps, that what we do and how we live out our life has a lot to say what the final meaning of this story will look like. And the intellectual life rooted in God's friendship would help us understand better how to choose so that this story itself ends as the way in which God intends. To experience the life of the mind is to experience an erotic desire to be in love with all that is. And ultimately, again, is to be in love with God. And it's in that experience then we can raise the questions about what am I, who am I, why is there evil, all those sorts of things that puzzle us and maybe don't have answers at the ready, but still are questions that God wants us to raise, to be honest, and not shy away. So let me just conclude by reading a lengthy quote. And this is from Professor Fred Lawrence in the theology department, who's been my friend and mentor for a number of years since I've been here at BC. So he writes, the intellectual life in the context of friendship with God underscores the fundamental point that the conversational God's communication of Trinitarian self-meaning becomes constitutive, that is, it makes us, becomes constitutive of our own personal and communal self-meaning. How this occurs in a process of mutual self-mediation by which the conversation that we are as human beings gets caught up into the divine conversation as revealed in the eternal Word made flesh. Our self-meaning becomes a function not just of the objective common movement of the mystical body of Christ, which the teaching office of the church is one aspect, but it's the self-meaning of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Thank you.
Professor, I was wondering,
Where are you? Oh, you're
right here,
down.
how you and the great thinkers would distinguish between... Okay. There you go. All right. Would distinguish between what you mentioned about self-sovereignty or self-centeredness and taking care of oneself to be able to be in those healthy friendships or be with community or with God.
All right, so I think one of the issues that I didn't particularly mention, but I think it's important in terms of the topic, is this notion of discernment that comes out of the spiritual exercises of Ignatius and so the tradition of the Society of Jesus. And to take discernment seriously is to basically try and get a handle on what's really going on inside of your affective life and what movements are leading you, I think, to life and what movements could be leading you towards, as Eric Vogelin says, death. That is, to a kind of life that could be empty or lack significant meaning. There's always been the notion in the mystical tradition in the West of the care of the soul. And the care of the soul are those kinds of practices that men and women engage in to help them be able to better understand what's the difference between authentic care and how that gets lived out in relationships, or what ends up being caring for myself more in terms of a kind of self-centeredness. And that's why it's so important to be in conversation with people that you trust, because you got to talk to someone about this. So that's my answer. Does that fit your question? Okay. Thank you. Blakesley.
Hello, Dr. Brayman.
Yeah, I'm going to pay up.
Thank you for your talk. So from your talk there, there seems to be an implication when you talk about friendship that either side in a friendship has to have a certain religious orientation and an openness to greater truths, if that's a better way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, you can stop me if I'm wrong.
No, I will go on a limb and say that in any authentic relation or any authentic friendship, there should be at least an openness to the question.
Right, and so, and I would also suggest that there's a certain common language that's spoken between two people. Like when you talk about greater meaning and significance, that they know what you're talking about. And I think about seniors who are going off and graduating soon, and are going to go, and it's easy in BC when we all are forced to read Plato and Aristotle, and we know what Agape, Latte means. But going out and making new friendships with people who speak a different language, who speak a language influenced by the cultural ethos of a rights culture or of the Lockean self-sovereignty that you spoke of. And how do you engage in friendships with those who haven't had that experience and don't speak that language, and how do you open them up? Or is it possible? Thank you.
You kidnap them, and then you torture them, and then actually, John, that's a great question. One of the things that what? Okay, turn around. I mean, Jesus. Okay, so a couple things. I think it's true, and if all of you just reflect upon your own experiences, you'll find that you tend to gravitate towards those people that you instinctively feel have certain kind of common meanings that you share. And that even though there may not be a complete kind of accord, but the person comes across as someone who is really interested in the questions that get raised, and vice versa, and you're interested in the way in which that person raises questions. And it's in those friendships that I think a lot of kind of self-understanding, self-knowledge can come to the fore. Now, you may find yourself in a situation where there's some fundamental things you don't agree upon, and then you just have to figure out how that's going to move forward. Is this okay so far? Okay. Thank you. The other thing is that it's also, I think, true to say, is that there are those people that you will encounter who could really care less, who have no interest in these kinds of questions, and so they're not going to be the kind of friend that you're interested in. It will be a person whom you have to work with, you may socialize with, but in the long run you realize that there's something going on that just isn't going to kind of move us any further along in terms of being friends. That's stuff you just have to let go, and just always be attentive, though, to the possibility that maybe there could be a turnaround. A person may say, you know, John, I heard you say something the other day, and I'm kind of interested. I mean, there's always that possibility, but and sometimes you're just not going to change anybody's mind. Okay, one of the things that I didn't talk about and mention, though, there is the problem of biases, and all of us have biases. All of us have already these kind of thematics that shape the way in which we see the world. And those biases can get in the way of raising the kinds of questions we ought to raise. Could be fear, too. I'm afraid, I don't want to know the answer. I'm not sure what this means. I need to shut it down. So there's all that. So part of it, I think, goes back to the answer of the young man just a moment ago, is you got to be attentive to what's going on. And you've got to kind of discern, is this friendship worth pursuing, or is this something that will, moves in a different direction, and that's okay. All right? Yes. Nate.
Thank you. So in answer to John's question, you were talking about people who couldn't care less and how they might be good for socializing, but that's ultimately not the end of it. My question then is a follow-up, and what really is the end of a proper friendship, and how does that manifest itself in how two people communicate and what they're doing in their lives? Like, I mean, it's a bit. I'm sorry if it's a bit like overly simplistic, but I'm just trying to like ask like what are people going towards when they have like this kind of friendship focused on like asking the questions and trying to seek the answers to the questions, and like where does that stop, and like what does that stop in?
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. To go back to Aristotle, in what he calls a friendship of excellence, what am I concerned with? I'm concerned with the good of the other. And what do I mean by the good of the other? I'm concerned that this person is living his or her life out, from Aristotle's point of view, in terms of a commitment to virtue. And that friend is concerned about the same thing with me. Therefore, neither one of us will put our friend's virtue in jeopardy. So I would never ask you to do anything to violate your own commitment to what you want to be as a virtuous human being, and vice versa. Also, what takes place, and this I think manifests itself, I mean, if you just think about the people that you consider to be your closest friends, and just ask yourself, what have I learned about myself from this person? What has this person helped me come to understand? And there'll never be an end point in which you can say, yeah, I know myself. I'm pretty much together, and I'm going to take my act on the road. I mean, Augustine himself pointed out the fact that I am always and will always be a mystery to myself. But without men and women in our lives who love us and want what's best for us, there's no way in which we can continue to kind of unpack that mystery, because we will continue to rationalize our behavior, justify the things that we do, and tell ourselves that, yeah, I'm really a great guy. So, friendship should be rooted in something significant. Commitments to something greater than oneself, whatever that might be. So, well, Charles Taylor talks about the fact that committing yourself to something like justice or other sorts of these kinds of issues that we talk about here at BC is a way. But in the long run, I think friendships are important because they keep us fundamentally honest about who we are and why we're doing what we're doing. I don't know. Is that close? Does that make any sense to you? Okay. These are good questions. Okay.
Professor,
Speak to me.
you suggest that friendship by nature is radically open to participation in a religious community. With Lonergan's talk of ethics of authenticity, I can see that if you were coming not from a religious background, the entrance into a religious community would be a very long and difficult process, given the demands of authenticity. What advice would you give for people coming not from an explicitly religious background into that long journey of questioning to even consider entering into an established religious community?
Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar, no, it's too cheap what I was going to say. Are you an MA student? No. But you've read Lonergan. Okay. So the best way, so two ways that I'm going to answer this. One is, Lonergan talks about human authenticity as intellectual, moral, and religious conversion. And by religious conversion, he doesn't mean belonging to a specific denomination. What he means by religious conversion is the experience of being grasped by infinite love. And in that experience of being grasped by infinite love, it reorders everything about how you think about your life and the choices you make. Now, it is true that there are people who spend their life journeying in terms of this question of God. And there are two people that I have in mind whom I think are really, primary examples of honesty, truth-seeking, but they never entered into a kind of specific religious denomination. And the first would be Simone Weil and her book, Waiting for God. And one of the things, and she was a French intellectual, and she certainly was a religious woman in the sense that this question about God was really paramount to her. And she had this long correspondence with a Dominican priest about eventually coming into the Roman Catholic Church. Her decision was, if I remember correctly, her decision was, I just don't think that's anything that I can do, because my vocation is to speak to the atheists. So she thought that her own kind of religious orientation was to be in conversation with non-believers, or I should say with atheists. And so that's one reason that's one of the primary reasons. The second person that I think is really a model for integrity is Albert Camus, another French intellectual, maybe familiar with the myth of Sisyphus. I would recommend actually The Plague and the Fall as the best things he wrote. And Camus was a person who never, ever claimed to, quote, believe in God, but it was always an open question for him. He was always a person that thought that somehow this was in the rubric of seeking truth. He himself never answered it explicitly, but it was always a question to be aware of and not to shy away from. And so in that sense, I know this is going to sound condescending, I don't mean it to, but I think those who call themselves atheists but are serious about the question, those people are to be really admired because of the willingness to be courageous and to continue to raise that kind of question, even though an answer may not come forth for them. Does that help? Well, that didn't look like it was a great... Did I answer your question, or did I do what I always do, skirt it?
Probably also, maybe for those who aren't, trapped like Camus, but just, it's okay. That's good. I'm sorry.
Okay.
We have time for one more question.
Annabelle.
So, actually going, why are you laughing? I haven't even asked my question.
I know.
Okay, so.
Deja vu all over again.
Well, going off of that question, so you do believe that you can lead a life of excellence and basically transcend self-centeredness without God in your life. You can.
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and you can transcend yourself and you can move beyond self-centeredness, but I would want to argue that it's always a kind of limit issue. That the fullness of understanding what it means to be human, from my perspective, ultimately means being in conversation with God. Whatever that means for you.
Well, from that, I mean, you can have a conversation with God and it would make you a better person, but wouldn't that almost be the same as having a conversation with yourself and putting yourself against who you are and who you were and trying to make yourself better for yourself as well as your friendships and your community and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, there's a couple things here. First of all is that in other words, if you are serious about praying, to God, however you're trying to conceive that. Then in the deepest recesses of your being, you know that it's not an interior monologue, that there's something else there that you're in relationship and communion with and conversation with.
Can it not just be that you just love life and that you understand that there are mysteries and you want to attain that intellectual level? But like you said, I
think to really have the experience of falling in love with life is a real graced experience given to you by God.
It cannot just be taken?
No. Well, you know me. I don't love life.
Yeah, but but at the same time, like for insights, like you said, it's a gift.
That comes with gift, right.
But can it not be argued that it is something that you take advantage of the opportunities given to you?
Oh, absolutely.
It's really your own action.
No. Nope. This is where we disagree.
Okay.
You can set the conditions for an insight. You can ask the questions. You can do whatever work needs to be done. But when it comes, it comes. It comes unexpectedly, it comes suddenly, and it always comes in answer to a question. Now, what you do with that insight is an entirely different ballgame. But it comes to you as a gift. I mean, you just can't snatch it up and say, all right, here's the insight, this is what I need. I mean, you must know by now how difficult it is.
Obviously.
No, I mean, just your own experience so far in school. The way in which insights just, there's that famous story of Archimedes who was trying to figure out the crown for the king if it was gold or not. And he was, just busting his head and everything else. And one day he said, screw it, I need to go take a hot bath down in the city. So he's sitting in the bath, he drops something heavy, and all of a sudden he gets the insight that, yeah, I'm going to invent water displacement, The point is that he had done everything in his power to set the conditions, but when it actually happened, it was outside of his control.
We differ.
I know we do. I know we do. And that's fine.
All right.
And we're still friends.
Yeah, we are.
All right. Is that it, Dano?
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to thank all of you for being patient and kind and generous.